So Labour is pledging to nationalise the railways with the biggest overhaul, they say, in a generation. They vow to bring rail networks back into public ownership within their first term in power, a plan, they say, that prevents taxpayers from having to cover any compensation. In a minute, we're going to be talking to the Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Haigh. She's just getting microphoned up as we speak. So let's talk about what you've been saying about this morning. Alan, this will probably be your first question to her. Whose money are they going to use to buy out the old contracts and the changed liveries on the national network? Well, actually, they're not buying out the contracts,
they're going to wait till they
waiting for them to expire.
But there are a lot of questions on affordability. Scoot says Labour says they're going to sort out the railways, but how are they going to pay for it? That is something we should get to. Tinkerbell also says railways, power, water, they should all be nationalised again. Don't stop at the railways. So there are questions about, is it the right focus? Should we be starting with one of the other utilities instead?
There has been quite a lot of support overnight for this plan. But it's being said that there would be even more support if the Labour government was actually... Labour government, I'm jumping ahead. If there is a Labour government, they were to bring water back into national ownership. But I believe that our guest is ready to talk to us.
So the Conservatives have branded these plans pointless and unfunded. The big question, as we've been saying, is how Labour will pay for this. We're joined now by the Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Haigh. Good morning to you. Thank you for joining us this morning. So on this issue of how it's going to be funded, how do you plan for this to happen? Because, of course, there are fears that it will end up hitting the taxpayer.
Well, 30 years after privatisation, the taxpayer already funds our railways. The subsidy to railways is over £4 billion, about what it was just prior to COVID. And throughout privatisation, subsidy levels have been routinely at their highest on record. And the fact is the taxpayer can't afford to continue with the current broken model. Everyone knows that the railways are broken. Anybody who's had to rely on them recently knows that. We're facing record delays and record cancellations. And frankly, we're throwing good money after bad. You might remember a former Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, who, in response to an independent review that his government had commissioned, said that the reason that privatisation had never been accepted on Britain's railways was because its failings were so obvious that it led to more expensive railways, fragmentation and an inability to deliver the trains on time.
That's all the arguments for it to happen. We understand that. But on the issue of how it's going to be funded, because it's not going to be completely free, there are costs involved in doing this.
No, but the point I'm making is we already fund our railways. The taxpayer subsidises every single penny that is spent on the railways. The Treasury bears all the risk and private operators receive a management fee and money then leaks out to dividends and to shareholders, some of whom are owned by foreign governments. So the taxpayer is already bearing the full cost for our railways.
But the warnings are that we'll have to pay more. The chief executive at Rail Partners, which is an industry group, says that nationalisation is a political rather than a practical solution, which will increase costs over time. We've got warnings also that it could cost £10 billion from rail chiefs because your plan will drive up running costs by billions, though. So the fear is that it will end up costing taxpayers more in the end.
Well, look, Keith Williams, who wrote the government's independent rail review and was the architect of the Tory reforms, has endorsed Labour's plans this morning, as have widespread voices across the rail industry. We have assured expert figures that demonstrate that these reforms will actually save the taxpayer up to £2.2 billion per year because the current system is so wasteful and inefficient and because the taxpayer is already paying for our railways. So let me just give you a quick example. When delays happen on the railways, there are more than 300 people that are employed across the system whose job it is to argue with each other and to try and attribute blame rather than work out how to fix it and ensure delays don't happen in the future. When we have a publicly owned and controlled system, we won't have to compete against each other in the system. We can just make sure that delays don't happen and that we deliver for passengers.
Now, I wouldn't dream of asking you how old you are. So I don't know how much you might remember of the old British Rail, but certainly my generation, the generation ahead of me, and probably 1, 2, maybe even 3 generations behind me, remember British Rail, and it was a nightmare. I mean, it was just awful. It was totally unreliable. It was unpunctual. The trains were filthy. The staff largely were surly, and the food was unmentionable. I mean, the British Rail sandwich was a national joke. It was. Can you guarantee that it won't go back to being like that? And frankly, we'll just change how the system is run, but the reality will stay the same, that somehow Britain can't run a rail service.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I am, of course, far too young to remember British Rail. I've heard about these soggy sandwiches, but when was the last time you actually could purchase a sandwich on any train in today's railways? Look, this is a consciously new and reformed approach, and it is fundamentally different from anything that's been in the past. We really believe that the reforms we're bringing forward and the new cultural approach will be the first time that British Railways will be run in the interest of the passenger. As part of our reforms, we're abolishing Network Rail, and Great British Railways will take on those functions. A big part of the problem in British Rail was that it was run by engineers and didn't have passengers and customer outcomes in mind. It also suffered from extreme micromanagement from the centre. We are moving away from that model entirely, and this will be independent from government, devolved down to mayors. We'll give mayors a statutory role for the first time in the running of the network so that decisions can be taken as close to the ground. We know we don't want to return to anything in the past, and we know there's no point carrying on with the failed model. That's why this is consciously new, and we really believe this is going to deliver a better service for passengers, far better value for the taxpayer.
I want to ask you a question about the trade unions and pay in just a moment, but briefly, before that, why are you doing this with railways? Why isn't your priority the water industry? Because at least we have a degree of choice over the railways. We can either choose to use them or not. We can choose a network, but we have no choice as far as water's concerned, and that is a completely broken industry in this country.
Yeah, look, we know that there are massive issues that need fixing in the water industry. But as you know, as Rachel Reeves has set out repeatedly, we have ironclad fiscal rules in the Labour Party, which means we will not set out any unfunded spending commitments. And in a time of scarce public resource, nationalising the water industry right now would cost billions of pounds. So instead, we're setting out really sweeping legislative and reform changes that would apply criminal sanctions to the directors of water companies that pour sewage into our seas, and legislative changes to make sure that they invest in infrastructure and that they pay the price rather than consumers. We think that's the right approach on water. But where the settlement has failed on the railways, and we can do it within our fiscal rules, we're absolutely committed to public ownership. But we'll do it in the right way for the taxpayer, as well as the right way for those that use those services.
There are concerns that it would give the unions more control. We've had the response from Mick Lynch over this, General Secretary of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union. He says it's going to be in the best interest of railway workers, passengers and the taxpayers. We're already coming to a situation, aren't we, where, you know, we've seen rail services grind to a halt because of the ongoing strikes. ASLEF, the drivers are going to be striking again in the week of the May bank holiday. So what would you be doing to resolve that situation? Surely it's handing more control to them over that.
Well, look, the unions are already behaving in a way as if they work in a nationalised and publicly owned workplace. We're in the second year of the first national strike on the railways for over 30 years, and these disputes have been deliberately provoked by successive Tory transport secretaries. It's not just me or the unions saying that. The rail employers have said so as well. So I would make it my immediate priority to resolve this dispute, whereas my counterpart, the Tory transport secretary, hasn't met the unions for over 18 months. They think it's in their interest for these strikes to continue because they can blame the unions and blame the strikes rather than their own failings for getting the trains to run on time.
So a quick yes or no to this. Would you pay them above the rate of inflation?
I'm not committing to paying anything above what they've been offered so far.
Well,
so how would that help
tough to resolve it then, isn't it?
Well, there's lots of issues. There's lots of issues at stake in this dispute. And again, as I say, I'm not making unfunded spending commitments. I'm not going to make any commitment until I've opened the books and got to the negotiating table. But there's lots of issues at stake in this dispute.
The main issue is this, isn't it? The main issue is the stuff that chinks. But if you're not going to offer them any more, it does kind of undermine your pledge to resolve the dispute, because that's what it's about.
I would dispute that. In Labour-run Wales, they avoided any strikes from happening. They came to a good compromise, both on working conditions and pay, much earlier on. This dispute has been deliberately and consistently poisoned by the Conservatives, and that's why we're in the mess that we're in now.
All right. Well, good luck with that. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning.
Louise Haigh, Shadow Transport Secretary. Thank you.